So this morning, I want to open up. We're going to be talking. The title of the lesson this morning is Peter by the Fire. If you'll open up to John 18, that's where we're going to be dealing this morning. So to kind of give you a preview of where we are going this morning, we're going to go to the courtyard of the high priest, and we're going to meet a disciple who his heart is certainly full of love for Jesus, yet whose fear led him into denial. Peter's actions really show us something that is very human, and we're gonna see that, and we're gonna recognize that. We're probably gonna internalize some of this as well, because a person can love Christ deeply yet still fail when the pressure gets turned up just a little bit. So this passage helps us understand both the strength of Peter's affection towards Christ, but as well as the weakness of his fear. So as we walk through this scene here, we'll see Peter's, again, his sincere devotion and how fear got the better of him in a very critical moment. And the lesson also teaches us about watchfulness, courage, and the dependence upon the Lord. And then at the end, we're going to return back to Peter standing in that courtyard and ask ourselves, what, in his experience, what does it teach us about following Christ when the pressure is real in our lives? So, imagine a soldier who sincerely admires, really respects his captain, and wants to stand with him in battle. But when the battle suddenly becomes pretty dangerous, bullets start flying, that same person hesitates and pulls back just a little bit. His heart hasn't changed, but fear has suddenly taken hold of him. And that tension between love and fear is exactly what we're going to see in Peter in John 18. Again, first we see Peter's deep affection towards Jesus, no question about that. No one can honestly doubt that Peter truly loved his master. Earlier that night, if you remember, it was Peter who drew the sword in an attempt to defend Jesus. His action, a bit misguided, certainly revealed his loyalty and devotion. When Jesus was arrested, most of the disciples had fled, but Peter didn't run very far away. Instead, the Apostle John tells us in verse 15 that Simon Peter was following Jesus, and so was another disciple. So even after all of the chaos with the soldiers and the temple guard coming to arrest Jesus with clubs and torches and swords, even after all that chaos and the arrest of Jesus, Peter still stayed close enough that he could see what was happening. And that alone took courage. It would have been a whole lot easier on Peter's part and a whole lot safer for him to disappear into the darkness with the other apostles. But Peter's affection is seen even more clearly in the risk that he took by entering the courtyard of the high priest. Now, consider the scene here. Very often we look at the scene, we read these verses, and all we think about is, he's going to go in there and he's going to deny Christ 3 times. And that's about that. It's very it's true, but there's a whole lot more to it. When we put ourselves in Peter's position, they just arrested his master, and this was not, and he knew the importance of that arrest, much like Steve probably felt a little while ago. it's dangerous, and Peter knew that, but he followed into the very courtyard of the high priest. That's pretty bold. So this other disciple, likely John himself, had connections that allowed access to the courtyard, but Peter did not have that same assurance of safety on his part. The high priest didn't know him. They were not on maybe first name basis, but John was confident enough to go on in. So that really did. It took guts on Peter's part to go in there. Love for Jesus is what drove him into that courtyard. He wanted to remain near his Lord, even if there was danger surrounding him. You know, no selfish ambition on his part or an attempt for worldly gain could have motivated that decision. It was only his love for Jesus that allowed him enough courage to go into that courtyard. But alongside with Peter's love, we also see something else, that fearful denial that just mentioned a moment ago. The scene as he goes into this courtyard quickly changes for him. He's standing near the fire in the courtyard, and Peter is confronted by a servant girl who guarded the door. She asked him a very simple question, verse 17. "You're not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" The danger really seemed kind of small, right? This wasn't a judge that was approaching Peter. It wasn't a soldier. It wasn't a powerful official. It was a servant girl. Yet Peter immediately replied, "I am not." That moment there really reveals a strange inconsistency of human nature. The same man, same person who boldly swung a sword just a few minutes earlier in the garden now shrinks back from a simple question from a servant girl in the courtyard. Picture that. He is bold and he is swinging a sword. I mean, he wasn't just swinging, he hit somebody, Malchus, all right? Good thing he wasn't a better swordsman. He would have killed him. And then a little bit later, that same hero gets confronted by a servant girl and asks him a very simple question. Are you one of his disciples? So, that same man who earlier declared, "Even if all may fall away because of you, I will never fall away." Yet here he denies even knowing the Lord. Isn't that contrast pretty amazing when you consider putting those two extremes within just moments apart? The one who confessed Jesus as the Christ, the Son of the living God, now claims he isn't even one of his followers. That's a pretty drastic 180. But Peter's denial also highlights the danger of relying too much on emotional devotion alone. See, Peter's feelings towards Christ, they were sincere, no doubt about that at all. But strong feelings alone don't guarantee faithfulness. Earlier that night, Jesus had warned his disciples in Matthew 26:41, "Keep watching and praying that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." So when it's almost like Jesus is foretelling what is going to happen shortly. Not just with Peter, but with all of the rest of the apostles as well. Because was their spirit willing? Oh, absolutely, no doubt about it. But was their flesh weak? Yeah, a little bit. What did Peter do? He had slept instead of praying. And now he discovers how quickly weakness can overcome sincere devotion. Was he devoted to Christ? Oh, absolutely. But his fear was a little bit stronger. And there's another lesson here as well, and that's the foolishness of fear. See, Peter's denial shows how fear can lead a person into some pretty poor decisions. In that moment, Peter believed that he was being careful. He wanted to protect his life and avoid drawing any unwanted attention towards himself. From a purely human standpoint, makes sense, doesn't it? Yeah. Once he admitted being associated with Jesus, he didn't know where it was going to lead after that. So he wasn't even going to go down that path. He was going to, at the point of the spear, he was going to stop that thought right there. Because he didn't know where it was going to lead. He was afraid. So fear told him that denial, that was the safest path to go. That's the path he took. But this shows Peter's misunderstanding of what truly matters. See, the most valuable thing that a Christian possesses is not physical safety, but a living relationship with Christ. When fear of losing comfort or security becomes greater than the desire to remain faithful to Jesus, a person can easily compromise the truth. Jesus had already taught in Matthew 16, whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. See, true courage comes from understanding what cannot be taken away from you. When we understand that there is one thing that cannot be taken away from you, then that helps us to understand and gives us a basis for true courage. See, later in life, Peter would demonstrate exactly what that kind of courage really means. In Acts 4, the man who once denied Jesus, before a servant girl, he's now standing in front of the council before the Sanhedrin and boldly declares, "We cannot stop speaking about which we have seen and heard." That's the same guy. And that would be just less than 2 months down the road. He had gained that much faith, stability, and knowledge that he would stand in front of the very council that he is in this passage in John 18. Those same men that were questioning Peter and the high priest would have been members of the council. So the same ones that he's afraid of in John 18, he is in their face by the time Acts 4 rolls around. So Peter's not lost. He's just had a lapse. So the difference wasn't natural bravery, but spiritual maturity and dependence on the Lord. That's what allowed him to do that. Peter's failure also became a powerful teacher in his own life. Luke tells us after his third denial, the Lord turned and looked at Peter, and he went out and wept bitterly. And that memory would have stuck with Peter. And then later on, when he writes his epistle, 1 Peter, that memory didn't destroy him. It actually strengthened him because he encourages the Christians years afterwards. He says, "Be of sober spirit, be on the alert." Isn't that the same thing that Christ told them when he went into the garden? Be on the alert, pray. So Peter is trying to use those same words that Christ used on him earlier, and that's what he's telling us today. Be of sober spirit, be on the alert. And those words really kind of carry special weight when we remember the night that he had learned that lesson the hard way. So let's go back to that soldier for a moment. He enters that first battle. He's pretty confident, about his own strength. He believes courage comes from, comes naturally, and that he's never going to falter. He's never going to sway right or left. But when the battle finally begins, he discovers how powerful that fear really is. When the bullets start whizzing over your head and rounds start going off around you. So if he survives that initial experience, he often becomes a lot wiser, a lot steadier as a soldier. Not because he trusts himself more, but because he understands his weakness. Same person, but now he's experienced that weakness that he showed initially in that battle, afterwards. And sometimes that helps us to understand and grow when we understand our weaknesses and where it is that we need strength, where we need encouragement, where we need to grow. First time through, not easy, and sometimes we falter. See, Peter experienced that same transformation. His failure in the courtyard did not define the rest of his life. Instead, it became the turning point that taught him all about humility, about watchfulness, and dependence on Christ. So, what have we learned in this section here in John 18? We've seen the deep affection that Peter had for Jesus and the risk that he took in order to be near him. And we've also seen the sudden fear that led him to deny the very Lord that he loved. And we've also seen that he learned an important lesson, that sincere feelings toward Christ has to be joined with spiritual watchfulness and a faith in God. And it also reminds us of something encouraging, that even when we fail, the Lord who restored Peter is also able to restore us as well. One failure does not define us for the rest of our life. So John places Peter warming himself by the fire while Jesus is being questioned inside. This is an interesting parallel that the Apostle John uses when he writes his gospel here. He says that Peter is standing by a fire, a charcoal fire, and then there's only 2 times in the Scripture that the word charcoal fire is used. One of them is John 18, and the other one is in John 21:9. There's a very powerful spiritual contrast between those 2 passages, and John brings it out here. Peter denies Jesus beside a charcoal fire, and later, remember when after the apostles go out fishing, and they at the end of the next morning they come in, and Jesus is there on the seaside, and he's already got a charcoal fire going for them. And that's where he confronts Peter about, Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? At that point, Peter, Jesus restores Peter, his faith. So the first charcoal fire is when Peter denies him. The second time he's by a charcoal fire is when Jesus restores Peter. So, failure by one fire, restoration by another. So let's take a look at historical evidences of Christians facing death for refusing to deny Christ. I won't spend a lot of time in these. I think you're probably familiar with some of them. The Roman persecution, in the early centuries, Christians were often required to do something very specific when they were confronted. They were to offer sacrifices to the Roman gods or to Caesar, and to publicly deny Christ or curse his name. And refusal could result in immediate execution on their part. Romans carried a sword about that long, about 18, 19 inches long. It wasn't a long sword, it was a short sword, razor sharp. They laid on their chest, on a Christian's chest, and they knew that if they wouldn't do both of those things, then that sword was going to go through their throat. And then in about 112 A.D., Pliny the Younger, he was Roman governor in Bithynia, and he's writing to Emperor Trajan. And this is what he writes. He describes how he tested suspected Christians, those who denied that they were Christians. They repeated after me an invocation to the gods and cursed Christ, none of which those who are really Christians can be forced to do. So let me read that last part again. None of which those who are really Christians can be forced to do. Even at the point of death, they would not do that. Christians were expected to curse Christ to prove that they were not believers. Polycarp, well-known disciple of the Apostle John, when commanded to deny Christ, this was his response. 86 years I have served him, and he has done me no wrong. How then can I blaspheme my King and my Savior? At that point he was executed. And then the martyrs of Lyons, same thing. They had to renounce Christ and declare allegiance to the Roman gods. Many refused and were executed. There are a few that I will quote here, New Testament warnings about denying Christ. 2 Timothy 2:12, if we endure, we will also reign with him. If we deny him, he also will deny us. Matthew 10:32-33, therefore everyone who confesses me before men, I will also confess him before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, I will also deny him before my Father who is in heaven. Mark 8:38, whoever is ashamed of me and my words, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of him. Luke 12, do not be afraid of those who kill the body. Fear the one who has authority to cast into hell. Revelation 2:10, be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. See, the early Christians that I mentioned just a moment ago didn't just read those verses. They stood in front of a Roman authority and had to decide whether they believed them or not. Let's face it. In the United States today, anyway, most Christians are not facing a life or death denial. But we are regularly facing very subtle, everyday moments of pressure where the same issue is at stake. Some real life situations. How about silence in a conversation? There are times when spiritual topics come up in our conversations, whether it's at work, with friends, even family, and we stay quiet. Someone mocks Christianity. Someone misrepresents Scripture. Someone asks a moral question. And we think, this isn't the time. I don't really want to make this situation awkward. That may not be a spoken denial, but it can be a silence distancing yourself from Christ. Luke 9:26 again, whoever is ashamed of me and my words. Or how about going along with the crowd? Sometimes the pressure isn't verbal, it's behavioral. Laughing at something we know is wrong. Taking part in questionable activities. or blending in to avoid standing out. See, Peter stood by the fire trying to blend in. And that's a very modern temptation. I just don't want to stand out. It's easier that way. Or how about workplace pressures? This is one of the most common modern parallels, being asked to maybe compromise your integrity, avoiding mentioning faith for fear of it might affect your career, or hiding Christian convictions in order to fit in with the culture. No one outwardly says deny Christ or die, but the pressure becomes stay quiet or it may cost you something. How about social reputation? Today, denial often comes through fear of how we're going to be perceived, being labeled as intolerant or maybe too religious, or being, losing social standing. Today, we often fear reputation loss instead of physical harm. I don't want them to think less of me. Oh, and how about family pressures? Now it comes back home, right? Sometimes the hardest setting is close to home. Avoiding truth to keep the peace. Not speaking up about sin or spiritual matters. Downplaying faith. That avoids any tension, right? So let's bring it back to Peter. See, Peter wasn't facing execution in that moment. He was facing discomfort, uncertainty, and social pressure. And that's exactly where most of us live. He didn't deny Jesus in front of a judge. He denied him in front of a servant girl. That's what makes this passage relevant to us today. Most of us won't be asked to die for Christ, but we will be asked in small ways whether we belong to him or not. Denial today is often not loud or aggressive or intentional. It's usually quiet, subtle, driven by fear, just like Peter. So the question isn't just, would I die for Christ? The real question is, will I stand for him in the small moments where it cost me something? That's a question that each one of us has to ask in our daily walk, because all of us are going to be faced with some of those situations at one time or another, and how we respond. And it's like the soldier. First time through isn't always easy. I remember when we first became a Christian, I was working for Eaton Corporation in Kalamazoo. And they have a large cafeteria that everyone would come and eat. First time that I sat down to eat, and when I bowed my head to pray, it was inside tense, because before that, all your friends around you, you work with them, you've known them for a long time, but now you're publicly professing that you're willing to pray for your meal. It's not easy, but after a while, it became a whole lot easier, because with that practice, again, first time through, all of us fail at one point or another. But like with Peter, one time does not define your life. It's what you do with it afterwards.